Hey, Daniel.
Hey, Sam. Great to be with you today.
I read, I need to be checked on this, but about 30% of U.S. nonprofits receive government grants, totaling about $303 billion annually. And that supposedly includes over 35,000 nonprofits that rely on these grants. So given the new administration, we've heard from our clients that the changes in administration and the change of federal grants, it's created some concern, a little bit of anxiety, maybe a little bit of confusion on how people can think about or should think about their finances, budget, cash burn for those that have a good portion of their annual budget off of federal grants.
We certainly have seen clients that rely on government grants with a lot of confusion because of Trump's executive order. And the problem was not only the change in priorities, which I think everyone can expect with the change in administration, but there is the confusion of having a temporary pause on funding that was already committed, which was I think, larger issue that threw a lot of confusion into clients.
So for those listening to this, maybe it's a board member, maybe it's a director, what's most helpful for us to talk about what we know and what we can say where we're at today here at the end of February 2025?
I think it was a reminder to a lot of clients that they needed to keep an eye on what businesses usually refer to as working capital, just your cash on hand, your cash budgets, to know, a lot of times organizations are spending money in advance of getting reimbursed through these grant processes. And so if you're relying on a government grant and you're getting reimbursement, you're used to a certain schedule. You incur the expenses, you are running the program. At the end of the month, you submit a reimbursement request. Depending on the organization, that can go through quite quickly, and you have funds in your account. Depending on the grant, sometimes organizations are used to waiting 30, 60, 90 days for some of those funds to come through, and it creates a cash flow challenge for the organization to run the program. They know the funds are coming. It's just a matter of timing, but to be able to pay their employees, pay their expenses, run the program while they're waiting on the grant payment to come through. And as the recent issue kind of highlighted, even when you know those funds are committed, until they're in the bank, they're not available to pay for things. And so it just highlighted the issue of needing to have funds on hand, to have a reserve fund, to have maybe a line of credit or other sources available to you to draw on to navigate those temporary swings in your cash balances.
So when you think about everything you've seen or looked into, what percentage of folks, speaking very generally, do you think are in a good position for something abrupt like this versus those that maybe could work on what you just laid out?
I don't know that off the top of my head what the percentage-wise would be because it's so individual from case to case. But I think certainly well-run organizations often have a reserve fund of some kind. They have an investment fund of some kind that they can use to draw on. And even if they don't have those type of reserves, if they had the foresight to put a line of credit in place with the bank so that they have those funds available when something comes up, they have those available to draw. But I'm not sure what the percentage-wise would be there. It's more case-by-case basis, knowing what the organization needs are.
What's the common percentage of federal grants? Just, I know it's not for everybody, but is it 20%, 40%?
When an organization relies on government grants, it can be even higher than that percentage-wise of how they're running the organization. I've seen organizations that don't take any government funds, often faith-based organizations, don't want to accept any sort of government funds because they want the flexibility to run programs without following the guidelines that the grant funds would require. And so, you have everything on that extreme on one end where it's totally donation-based, no grant funding, to having organizations that are, 80, 90% grant funded, and they're just coming up with some sort of match or overhead percentage, outside of the government grants. So certainly, I think organizations know there's a risk to being heavily grant funded, and they try to have at least some source of donations or outside revenue. But because the grants are available, sometimes organizations end up more heavily reliant on those than they hadn't, expected to be.
For the sake of this conversation, let's say it's an organization and it's 30%? Is that a realistic number?
Sure.
What do you do if you got 30% of income potentially halted or changed or not going to be distributed?
Usually, in advance, like the government, grant cycle, the priorities might change, but your existing grant funding runs out. It doesn't get renewed. You have some lead time to make a plan and make some changes. Sometimes there's new grants that you can apply for that are maybe change the focus some, but you can move employees from focusing on one program to a slightly different program and match them up with new grant funding. But if you can't find the grant funding, then you're looking at making tough choices of laying off people, of ending programs that just are no longer sustainable.
What does that look like from a time frame period? In other words, if you're a person of faith, you're maybe praying through the unexpected, but can you talk through the psychology or from a leadership standpoint, how long do you pivot versus how long do you start to maybe make some really hard decisions that affects people's career and their livelihood?
If you have reserves in place, then I think you can look for natural timeframes to make a change. Maybe that's the end of the school year if you're focused on running programs for children, or sometimes there's a natural time to make a change or a shift. And so if you have some reserves of funds in place, or a grant period is coming up, you can see that cycle coming, in 2, 3, 4, even sometimes 6 months out. You have noticed that funding is going away, and it makes for an orderly transition. I think with the recent news, there was the potential for some of these organizations to have to make a decision, in 2 weeks or 3 weeks if they're looking at not getting funding that they had counted on, which that was, I think, the part that caused a lot of consternation.
Has anything changed since that announcement was made a couple weeks? Do we know anything now?
So the administration rescinded their order and things went back to somewhat business as usual. But I think it just put on notice a lot of organizations that what they thought they could count on was not necessarily, they're not able to rely on it quite as much as they would have expected. So it just leaves people thinking about reserve funds and thinking about cash budgets and wanting to make sure they have those in place in case something like this happens again.
So you're saying it got revoked, it got pulled back, and things are back to still normal to where they were?
Right, for the moment. Again, there's changing priorities, and so some of the grants might not get renewed, but I think for now, the grants that were in place, the contracts that were in place, they're back to being processed as usual. So I wanted to ask you also, how do you think about going about building relationships with bankers and others in maybe a major donor or someone that could step up and provide some temporary funding in a case like this?
I feel most comfortable sharing what I've learned from people that really know what they're doing. And it's what I've learned that's most effective is you try to get to understand somebody's interests and their passion and then plug them in to work that's being done. And somebody that we both know here out of Memphis, Tennessee, who is president of Leadership Foundations globally, is Larry Lloyd. And Larry has talked about it was a shift for him when he, instead of just coming in and asking for money or asking somebody that may give money or a organization, et cetera, ask them right off the bat, tell me about what your interests are. Tell me about what your passions are. And I personally, I'm 37, but I want to continue to adopt that. There's another individual I know that has given away a significant amount of money, millions and millions of dollars. Not going to share their name, but he talked about one of the most successful capital campaigns an organization has had, probably one of the most successful capital campaigns in the entire city that this organization is located in. It was all about matching people's personal interests and desires with the work that was being done. And so I think that if I was a director, just based off of my personality, I would want to have a really strong operations person. I would want to have somebody like yourself that I was working with and alongside, but I would be constantly out telling the story of the work and of the impact. But I'd also try to fiscally run our organization as efficient as possible. But I would constantly be trying to understand people of influence in the community. There's always a small amount of percentage of people that do most of the work. That includes boards and things like that. But I would be at the events. I would be at the networking events. I would cold call, cold email asking to come in and to tell the story. And I would be articulating the story of whatever we were doing in a very clear way. And then also trying to understand who had a passion and a heart for the work that we're doing. And so from what I see of nonprofits of all different sizes, of even people we serve, the people that do the best job growing the top line are the people that are spending 40 to 50% of their time, telling the story and trying to raise money. The problem is that leaves another 50% of the time on operations that somebody is not there. So I think you really need to have some humility and some teamwork on, making sure all the responsibilities of the organization are covered. Because if a director is just out raising money, then the organization itself is probably going to be on fire. And I think I've seen this with some of our clients where they're really grant heavy from a state or federal standpoint, but you got to go shake the bushes, I think, if you're going to try to go get more private funding and private donations and kind of offset some of this, the things that we're talking about today. And then obviously we see clients that spend a lot of money with development firms where they delegate the mailers, the emailers, all those kinds of things to really try to bring in those development dollars. And that stuff's expensive. But I think as an entrepreneur, if the leader of the organization is really spending a good portion of their time trying to understand people's passions, having good information on how they're using money, and they're just relentless about it day in, day out, I think that's going to be effective. And it seems to be very effective for nonprofits that we know.
Yeah, I think certainly the value of those relationships is highlighted when you get to a situation where there's an emergency need, or there's a true emergency and not just the boy crying wolf. In some organizations, they call everything an emergency, and I think it starts to lose some of its impact. But when you truly have a need and you've done the work to build those relationships in advance, I think it's much easier than to go and make that ask when you've done the groundwork of the relationships ahead of time.
So I guess what we're saying is there was some shock, there was some concern, and things maybe have normalized a little bit. But I think now what you're saying is it's important for any organization to really understand the priorities of the political party that is in control of their funding, and then see where you fall in line. And if you don't fall in line directly, then you may have more shot down the road. But then am I also hearing you that, let's say on a separate issue, if you get 30% or 40% of your funding pulled, hopefully you have good cash reserves. Hopefully you have a good operating line of credit. Hopefully you have a way to maybe draw down on an investment that you haven't tapped that's been making money, and you can maybe swallow a loss for 1, 2, 3 months or so to then try to pray and pivot on finding additional income sources through grants and things. But then you got to watch it. And that's why you really need your financials to be in really good shape, because after 2 or 3 or 4 months, you might need to start cutting programs, and you might need to scale back to balance a budget and then pivot the organization. Even those decisions are extremely hard, but you might not have another choice. Is that what you're saying?
For sure. I think when things are going well and you have money in the bank, sometimes there's the potential to overcommit yourself and to expand your programs because you have funds available. But if you're not putting aside some reserves and have that sort of, what for a household would be an emergency fund basically, but having, maybe 3 to 6 months of cash reserves on hand, then when you have a temporary disruption and your funding is not nearly as impactful to the services that you're delivering to your clients, to the frontline employees.
Got it. What else? I mean, you've talked about the issue, unexpected changes. You've talked about reserve funds. Is there anything about what do you do from reserve funds? If, let's say you're not fortunate, like some, to have some big endowment or to inherit an organization with some huge cash balance. How have you seen people get there?
So similar in some ways to a household budget, you have to think about putting aside funds each year into a reserve if you want to build that up. Certainly, I think there's the tendency to maybe idolize like an endowment fund, and that's what a lot of organizations would love to get to, just having an endowment in place that they're not touching the principal and they're just using the earnings to support operations. But even without like running a whole campaign to build an endowment fund, you can just through cost control, through watching your budget, continue to put aside funds each year into a reserve fund and slowly build that up over time. One of the ways I've seen organizations do that is through reserving their depreciation. So depreciation is a non-cash expense. If you budget for a depreciation and you're covering and your income's coming in to cover your budget, including the depreciation, then your cash balances are going up, and you can put aside an amount equal to your depreciation for future capital projects. For instance, for if you have depreciation expense, it means your buildings, your vehicles are getting older, and you know that you're going to have a future capital need. And so if you're reserving that depreciation, that's one way to build up your cash reserves for future needs. That's just one example of a way to kind of slowly think through how to reserve some funds each month, each year into that reserve fund.
Any other tools or things that you've seen that have been very effective?
The other part that you have to watch is just your annual, where you are in your annual kind of cycle. A lot of organizations have annual funding cycles where they receive a lot of funding at year end and then have leaner donation months during the summer. And so I think just the other part to pay attention is you have to watch your cost controls just as much when the donations are coming in as you do later in the year when donations aren't coming in. And I think the natural tendency is you have cash in the bank at the end of the year. You think that you can afford to have some extra expenses, and you're not planning far enough in advance to realize that those funds in the bank at the end of the year are really to support your operation in July and August when the donations are not coming in each month to cover your expenses. So I think it's just a matter of planning ahead on a far enough cycle that you realize that when funds coming in, whether or not those funds are available for current use or whether they're really for a month from now, 2 months from now, or 10 months from now.
What do you think prevents these things from happening? Is it the director doesn't see it? Is it the director doesn't have discipline? Is the board disengaged? What creates these things?
Sometimes it is a matter of board education. If you have boards that are excited about new programs, about new opportunities, then there's a tendency to authorize expenditures maybe in advance of, on a hope and a prayer that the funding will come in to support it. And so sometimes it's a matter of educating the board as far as what the current resources are and what you can afford to expand. Sometimes it's maybe a matter of consolidating some of those controls back from maybe program directors that aren't thinking about the budget and creating the processes in place, the financial controls in place to have the oversight and give appropriate, level of control to directors, but to recognize that what makes someone a good program director might not make them a good financial administrator. And so just making sure that the levels of financial controls in place and the authorization in place is clear for what a director is allowed to do and what they're not.
So I guess some takeaways from this, what we're discussing is be mindful of how much money you get on an annual basis from federal, state, or local grants versus private donations, and maybe assess, is that a good balance for where you want to be, not just today and the future? And then also know if you want to get in a different place that it's going to take a lot of work and time, but you're going to have to focus on it. And then secondly, you have to have good financials. You have to have good data, because if there's a shock through the system, like potentially what could have happened a couple of weeks ago, and you don't know where you're at, then it's hard to make decisions. And then third, if you're in a bad spot and you don't have a lot of cash or you don't have reserves, then you probably got to act faster than maybe if you do. But the goal is to have reserve funds. What's the goal of reserve funds, did you say? What should be a goal?
I would say 3 to 6 months of expenses. But again, you have to look at where you are on your annual sort of fundraising cycle. So having a reserve of 3 months might be totally sufficient at the end of the summer when you're about to come into a fall fundraising season. But at the end of December, you might need a reserve fund of 6+ months to make sure you have enough to get through the summer months that are coming.
So build reserve funds, and then working for an endowment's a totally separate thing, but you need to build reserve funds. And then if you're in a bad situation, then you gotta stay on it, think through it, pray through it, but then potentially make some hard decisions to not really put the organization at risk. And then a second thing we talked about is a line of credit. And that's really just talking to your bank, looking for banks that are good banks, good rates of return on cash, but can also understand your organization and get that line of credit when you don't need it. So you have access to liquidity, but then also make sure your financials are in order. So you're being wise on how much any liability you're taking out with the line of credit. And then the third is capital management, working capital. And how would you define the difference in working capital between those two things?
Part of working capital is just that there is enough cash in the bank to pay for the immediate expenses before you get reimbursed for them. A lot of times you have receivable balances that are assets. You're going to have money come in, but you just need the funds in place to pay for expenses up front before some of those things are received. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but just a matter of having not just the reserves in like an investment account or something, but having money in your checking account to be able to write the check to the vendor when it's due instead of putting somebody off.
So you're not having to like hold up paying people payables, or you're not having to things are inconsistent. If you have enough working capital, you're not scared about paying your bills and just keeping things more steady week in, week out. Is that what you're saying?
Right. It makes things go a lot smoother when you're not stressed about making payroll.
Yeah. Okay. So regarding federal grants, regarding all these different things that we've talked about with cash flow funding, cash management, the only other thing I'll add is, we've definitely seen people that had more than 3 to 6 months of cash sitting in a checking account, not making them any money. Where, I was with an organization earlier and they got a very large multi-million-dollar grant. They were able to front load to get the grant, but they just had to put it on their balance sheet and they couldn't draw off of it yet, but they're still making $200,000 a year in interest. And that's powerful for an organization. And I've been kind of surprised to see certain organizations that hadn't really thought about being stewards of their excess cash. And then we see some banks are better than others, and then how they can invest that cash. And then also we've seen people like Infinite Giving that have built a whole business around this space. Anything else you have on this topic today?
I think that's it for now.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Sam. Hey, everyone. This is your co-host, Daniel Weaver, and I'm the managing partner with CFO Leverage. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Maximize Your Impact podcast by CFO Leverage. If you've enjoyed this episode, would you share this with a friend or leave us a review on your podcast platform? If you have questions about what you've heard or want help creating a solid administrative and financial foundation at your nonprofit, we want to hear from you. Please contact Sam Coates or myself on our website, www.cfoleverage.com. That's www.cfoleverage.com. Have a great day and go maximize your impact.